Hello and welcome. Prigozhin is admitting defeat in his power struggle with the Russian military, and there are some reports about Russians fleeing from Crimea in expectation of a Ukrainian conquest. We'll investigate that further. This and more in this situation report. First of all, James Vasquez is back. I mentioned him in the last situation report because he's one of the most popular foreign volunteers that was in Ukraine. He deactivated his Twitter account and now he's back, and in a New York Times article titled with the chapter about him, A Million Lies, there is said that he said he's a staff sergeant and was a veteran of Desert Storm and other things, and this is actually not the truth, and he left the Army Reserve as a private first class. Nevertheless, this should be it for now. I don't see any reason to put any more effort into this topic to discuss it further, because we already have the next unpleasant topic. There is a new article in German media that, according to research, Russian warships have been at the position where later Nord Stream pipelines blew up. One of the ships is actually carrying a mini submarine that has a mechanical arm and thus is able to place explosives if needed. The supposedly proof, I haven't seen it. I've seen one satellite picture that supposedly is from that, but I can't really identify anything on that, so I cannot say much here. And to be perfectly honest with you, the topic is annoying me increasingly because we have new theories every few days, and the only thing that can be done now and then is to show that those theories were mostly nuts, nowhere close to the reality. They can be disproven again and again, and we are nowhere close to actually having proof to who was it. Nevertheless, we have an interesting video here. This shows how the situation still is in Ukraine. The Rasputitsa is still in full swing, the mud season. We see an example here from Ukraine where a off-road truck, a military truck, is able to still drive, but it shows how even if Ukraine was able to do the counteroffensive now, it would probably be smart to wait a little longer. But we'll come to that in a little later in the situation report. Let's go to the actual developments along the front line here. We have reports from the north of Russian attacks on Snikivka. I heard about further attacks against Makivka, which is here, and against Terny. All those attacks have failed, but there was further fighting around Crimea and somewhere in the south to southwest, somewhere in this area. The Russians have probably gained some ground in the forest here, but that was it north of the Seversky Donetsk. South of it, we have fighting for Bilohorivka and Verkhno-Kamianske. The Russians have advanced. There is some indication that they have advanced southeast of Bilohorivka, but I cannot confirm any advances towards Bilohorivka or Verkhno-Kamianske itself. Around Bakhmut, the fighting is still intense, even though it has slowed down from past weeks. We have actual image proof of a Ukrainian counterattack that was going on north of Bakhmut. We see a tank here that was shelling Russian positions. I can't show you the video because it shows a lot of corpses, but there you can see it is localized more or less between Salisnyanske and Orikhovo-Vasilivka, so that should have been more or less here, indicating us that the Ukrainians have advanced or at least attacked in that direction over the last few days. In Bakhmut itself, there are reports of Russian advances in the north of town that seem to be likely. There's also some reports of Russian fighters having crossed the Bakhmutivka, the river that divides Bakhmut, and over which the Ukrainians have evacuated a few, like 2 weeks ago or something like this. I cannot fully prove it. The video I've seen that supposedly showing that didn't fully convince me, but it seems that it's at least quite possible that the Russians have crossed the Bakhmutivka. What I can confirm, though, is that there have been Russian advances in this area here, right south of Ivanivske. We have a geolocalized pictures again from a video. Again, lots of corpses there, so I can't show it to you because they were shelled with artillery after they advanced, but the locations are right at Ivanivske. So more or less in these positions here, pushing right towards the road. And this is obviously really important because here we have the main line of communication that is still possible towards the Ukrainians, whereas cutting it here is not that big of a deal, as the Ukrainians can still use the northern road here, that cross connection. But here, the only alternative they have is here close to Horomove, which is probably under fire as well. Other than that, that was it already around Bakhmut itself. We have the Ukrainian army commander Oleksandr Syrsky, who said that the majority of the fighting around Bakhmut is still happening through Wagner, important for the later phase of the situation report. But he's saying they're now getting reinforcements from the VDV, which are the airborne troops, and from other conventional units. And that is being said by by Colonel Kherevati from the Eastern Command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Around Avdiivka, there's continued fighting. We have reports of attacks into Avdiivka itself, but also in the direction of Novokalynove. Here, there are some reports that the Russians have gained some grounds. Other Russian military bloggers refute that. There are attacks in the direction of Stepove reported, in the direction of Severne. All seem to have been without success, and the Russians claim that they have advanced somewhat in the direction of Pervomaiske and that they have fire control over the road here to Orlivka. Basically, over this here, they claim that they more or less can see it and shoot anything moving there. Further south, there are some indications of further activity in Marinka and Vuleda, but no confirmed bigger advances here, nothing big that I can confirm in any ways here. On the southern front, Russian military bloggers are still talking about smaller attacks by the Ukrainians. Some even claim that the Ukrainians gained some ground, but nothing that it comes close to a serious offensive. If those attacks are currently happening, which seems likely, then they are probably recon attacks, reconnaissance in force, but not an actual counteroffensive yet. And there's also a report about further commando activity over the Dnipro from both sides. So both sides now and then cross the river to do raids on the other side. Nothing has changed there, as well as the artillery fire that is happening across the whole front line. So obviously in this area as well. Generally, though, Prigoshin said in an interview, Ukraine has now raised 200,000 men reserves for an offensive. Around Bakhmut, there are 80,000 men in Sloviansk, Bakhmut, and Konstantinivka ready to attack the Russians here. Girkin, who was mentioned quite a number of times here, that was wrong. Girkin, who said that he is, to put it mildly, skeptical about the numbers. Girkin, a former intelligence officer of the Russian armed forces, an ultra-nationalist who is a very good source when it comes to criticizing the Russian military, as he is an ultra-nationalist and he has no reason to write them down, at least mostly no reason to diminish the capabilities. And his past predictions have been on mark when it came to Russian capabilities. So he claims that these numbers that Prigozhin are unlikely, and the likely explanation for that would be that that Wagner is exaggerating numbers, that Prigozhin is exaggerating numbers in hope that the situation Wagner is in right now is being seen as more dire than it actually is, so they will receive more weaponry. That is at least one interpretation for all of this. The speaker of the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, Vadim Skibitsky, said the Russians have proven that they are not capable of doing strategic offensives with different axes of attacks. But the speaker of the US National Security Council, John Kirby, said the Russians will likely try to do new offensives in the coming weeks, potentially with several offensive axes. So we will have to see which side here will be right. I guess we can just observe it. The GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, also said that the Russians only have 15% of their precision weaponry left that is long range, so cruise missiles, etc. Right now they can only fly 2 attacks a month to keep up their reserves, and the production rate that Russia can keep up is roughly 20 to 30 caliber and KH-101 per month, even less Iskander, according to the Ukrainians. The British Ministry of Defense is believing Russia is now moving away its focus from Bakhmut towards Crimea and Avdiivka. There are some indications for that, especially the Ukrainian reports that the focus on Bakhmut seems to go down. The attacks are going down, but we also have the reports that Wagner is receiving help from conventional forces, so we will have to observe this in the future. Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian military commander, said the front line at Bakhmut is now stabilized, so he believes the Ukrainians shouldn't lose too much territory there anymore. But Zelensky himself said a counteroffensive cannot happen right now because Ukraine is still lacking the necessary ammunition and tanks to do that. So at the very least, they will probably wait for the promised tanks to arrive before any offensive can happen. When it comes to the Crimean Peninsula, we have a report that went around the last few days that the GUR is saying Russians are evacuating the Crimean Peninsula. There are reports that they are selling their houses, that families are getting evacuated. But to be perfectly honest, it seems highly unlikely that this is happening in a big scale. Because of the attacks with drones, there might be some justification that certain administrative posts are being moved to Russia proper, out of the occupied Crimea. We can argue about whether maybe some archives are being moved that to save them from a potential shelling, but that we can see right now that the Russians are basically already giving up on Crimea seems unlikely. It's very likely, though, that the report is true to a certain degree. It's just maybe a little overinterpreted, because it makes perfect sense that some Russians there in administrative positions make the deliberate decision to sell their property right now and move their family, because it makes perfect sense. The price you can fetch for a house in Sevastopol right now will definitely be several times higher than you might fetch for that house if the Ukrainians have reached the isthmus of Perikop and are now more or less in shelling range of Sevastopol. So that's at least some administrators think ahead and think, oh, this might not end too well. Let's rather collect the money I can get right now and get my family to safety. Is not that big of a surprise. The question is, are we talking about 20 families, about 20 people, or are we talking about 80% of the staff? And there is no real distinction, no real explanation to that. So I would probably expect we're talking more about 10 to 20 people or 10 to 20 families than the overall. Because to expect that the Russians are basically or officially basically already giving up on Crimea, that they seriously believe Crimea will be lost, seems highly unlikely at that very point. Even though there are, to try to stick to it, there are some indications that at least some of it might be justified, some worries, because we have here a video supposedly from right now, from the past few days, about the railroad bridge, and you can see over the Straits of Kerch, you see the road bridge here, and that's the railroad bridge, and we see that it's still heavily damaged, even though there are supposedly trains going over it. When it comes to the mobilization, we have a report from Bloomberg that Prigozhin wants to orient Wagner back towards Africa. He wants to focus Wagner on Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Right now, though, this is definitely not the case. Wagner is still fighting around Bakhmut, and as we've just heard from the Ukrainian side, they are saying the majority of the attacks is still Wagner, not someone else. Prigozhin seems to acknowledge, though, that he lost his power struggle with the military, and he seems to be in damage control mode now. In Africa, he can still be of use for the Russian government and for the Russian power establishment, as he allows for deniability when it comes to his Wagner mercenaries, whereas Russian regular forces couldn't do the very same. He is also not in the way of the Russian armed forces there. He's not a danger to them in any ways. He can be useful. After the mobilization in Russia, the need to use Wagner has massively diminished. We have to see that Wagner appeared on the front line long before the mobilization, as Russia was struggling and trying their best to avoid that they have to go through a mobilization, basically acknowledging how bad the fight in Ukraine is going. So they were looking for every capable fighting force, everyone they could send towards the front line, and obviously Wagner was a choice. Now, as Russia can more or less pull in troops as much as they need, as a lot of political barriers have fallen, there's simply no need anymore for a separate military organization when you can get everything you want by yourself. This has led, though, in the past to Wagner being used and to the rise in fame and power of Prigozhin, but by announcing or by planning to withdraw from the scene, going back to Africa, he basically is showing Gerasimov and Shoigu from the military establishment, but also Putin, that he's no longer going to be a problem. So we should expect that he might actually not fall out of a window, as many others have done so far in this war. He should also, if Bloomberg is right here, if this planning is announced to the Russian establishment, he probably can have some hope that at least some of his forces will not be expired, will not be attrited around Bakhmut, that he might be allowed to withdraw in time before they have been eaten up by Ukrainian fire, to save some of his power struggle, as he's basically telling the Russian establishment, you will need my forces, and they won't be a trouble for you anymore, so please let them live. A withdrawal from Bakhmut without coordination of the Russian armed forces seems impossible. That would be more or less treason towards the Russian government, so that would be the personal end for Prigozhin. So the other reports that VDV units and regular units are coming might be a hint that Wagner might soon be withdrawn, but in total we have to say that de facto he is accepting and acknowledging his defeat in the power struggle. In an interview, he also praised the military and helped propagated and advertised the recruitment efforts by Wagner, but also for the volunteer units of the Ministry of Defense. So he's showing he's trying to improve relationships again. All of this is a clear sign of his personal defeat. When it comes to other news about the mobilization, we have news that new units are being raised. Many of them are coming from integrating former DNR and LNR units, the units from the so-called People's Republic, the Russian puppet states in eastern Ukraine. And they are mostly turned into motorized rifle brigades. That shows that they will not be focused on heavy weaponry, not focused on tanks and IFVs, which would be an indication of an increasing struggle by the Russians to actually generate enough of those IFVs or enough of those tanks to equip units. And according to Telegram, there are reports here that Putin has now created a new bravery medal for courage that can also be given to foreigners and to stateless persons, another sign that Russia is trying to use them and using them as far as it can to preserve its own manpower. The Ukrainian Resistance Center is saying the Kremlin wants to recruit 2,000 men from Gwaz service, which is a Belarusian PMC that was personally created by Lukashenko. So they are trying to recruit Belarusians to fight for them in some way. And the Ukrainian Resistance Center is also saying 100 mercenaries from Angola have arrived, which are the result of negotiations of Lavrov visiting Angola a few months back in the past. Medvedev has declared that Russia will produce 1,500 main battle tanks in 2023, but according to media reports, Ural Vagonzavod is currently only producing 20, and it's the only 20 per month, and it's the only tank factory that is actually producing MBT. So in total, it would be 240 instead of 1,500, so more or less 1/6 of the overall strength. 1/6 of the overall attempted numbers. Now, it's unclear whether it's just Medvedev being Medvedev. We know that of him by now, or whether he just simply includes every restored tanks, as Russia is already running 18 factories to repair battle damaged tanks and to restore stored tanks back to working order, and they're currently building 2 more of those factories. In total, that might lead to the numbers, but the Russians are currently losing 150 to 170 tanks per month, so this will not be enough to make up for the losses. Girkin, again, is making fun of it, and he's saying that maybe they are talking about toy tanks made out of plastic, or paper tanks made in schools, because he acknowledges that Russia is nowhere close to having the capacity to actually produce 1,500 tanks. Ukrainian officials initially boasted of, I have more information about the volunteers that is coming from the New York Times, that the Ukrainians said they recruited 20,000 potential Legion volunteers, but not only did not many of those not actually enlist, a lot of them left later or fled, for instance, after the attack on the recruitment center in the beginning of the war. And right now, supposedly only 1,500 are currently fighting in the Foreign Legion. So we have some numbers about we have some data about their numbers right now. We also have a report from the UN mission for the surveillance of human rights. Its leader, Matilda Bogner, said that both parties in this war, Russians as well as Ukrainians, have executed prisoners of war without a process, and both mistreated prisoners. The Ukrainians are obviously angry about this, but as an observer, I have to say it's simply the truth. I have seen personally several videos of executions of prisoners. Even though several is a bit much, I think I can remember 2 videos of Ukrainians killing Russian prisoners of war. We've seen a lot of mistreatment of prisoners of war, at least according to the Geneva Convention, especially at the beginning of the war, for instance. They were mocking, the Ukrainians were mocking Russian prisoners of war, were forcing them to curse Putin and things like this. Now, this is obviously a different thing to mutilating somebody. I've seen a video of a Russian soldier castrating a Ukrainian prisoner of war. We've recently talked about the published execution of a Ukrainian prisoner of war. Things like that are different, but in pure factuality, it's simply the truth. Ukraine, I've seen pictures of Russian prisoners of war being executed, but I think I remember 2 videos, and one of them was questionable, and then later it was clear that it was perfidy happening in the capture of the prisoners. So the other comrades of the one who acted in perfidy probably died in the ensuing firefight. So in total, I can confirm that Ukrainians mistreated, and I can confirm that Ukrainians executed prisoners of war, but I can confirm 2 cases of Ukrainians executing and a couple of mistreatments, but nowhere close to what I've observed from the Russian side. So technically it is true, but the difference is in volume seems to be massive. And other than that, obviously there's a massive difference, as I like to say here. War crimes are fairly common in wars. It's humans under huge stress, and things are happening under this, but the big difference is how do states react to war crimes. And here we've seen, at least when it comes to lip service, and we have to emphasize this, unfortunately, when it comes to lip service, Ukraine is upholding its efforts to punish prisoners of war. It's upholding its lip service to punish violators of the rules of war, not prisoners of war. They are doing their utmost best. They are claiming that they do investigations and they'll find out, and if it's true, people are getting punished. But as so far, I have not heard about a single court case of a Ukrainian war criminal inside of Ukraine. I have not heard about a single arrest, and I even asked Ukrainian sources, and unfortunately, they were not able to confirm it either. So when it comes to the full adherence of Ukrainian side to those events, to punishing war criminals, unfortunately, I cannot confirm that it's actually happening, but at least they are doing lip service. On the Russian side, they are plain out denying that it's even happening. So you already see a massive divide here. And finally, we come to the international support. The US are saying they still haven't seen any Chinese weapon deliveries, but it might obviously still happening. And the Polish ammo producing company Desamet will, according to news from the Polish government increase its production quite significantly to help Ukraine with ammunition financed by the European Union. And then we have a video here of a Defiant-class petrol vessel, one of those that was delivered to Ukraine by the United States, and as expected, Ukraine is using it on the Dnipro. I'm sorry. And here we have something. Germany has delivered 3 DAX AEVs. Those are interesting vehicles and can be of a massive use in a future offensive for the Ukrainian side here, because with this pioneering vehicle, which has at least some level of armor, they can actually fill up tank ditches. So one of those, if it's not being destroyed by the Russians, will turn a tank ditch into will remove the obstacle created by a tank ditch within 2-3 minutes. So those vehicles, this is one of the examples where against every defensive measure the Russians are putting up, there are potential ways to engage with it. But they obviously have to receive enough of it. They have to employ them efficiently and competently. And those we will see whether they'll succeed with this. And finally, we have an interesting video here of the return of the Tachanka. Tachanka was this year. It's from the Russian Civil War. It's a Maxim machine gun on a cart pulled by horses. It was used extensively by the Red Army in the Russian Civil War, and we see here a modern version of it on it seems to be a Hilux or something like this, where they've actually set up basically a modern Tachanka. Even with the original guns, we see a triple mounted Maxim machine gun here. Now this is a very old machine gun. It's actually the first fully employed and fully accepted machine gun in service, used by basically all sides in World War I and by the Soviet Union in World War II. It has a fairly slow rate of fire of roughly 600 rounds per minute, and it shoots the 7.62 by 54R R cartridge, which is considered more or less obsolete, but still readily available and very powerful at the same time. But one thing that this machine gun has as an advantage, it's water cooled. So the rate of fire you can put out without having to stop for a barrel change or without the gun being impossible to use anymore is much higher than with its modern equivalent. That's obviously for the cost of heavy weight. So it's not an ideal weapon in a modern war, but in a use like this, it might actually be of some help. And it's an interesting example of history. And there were reports that the Ukrainian side had 35,000 Maxim machine guns in storage at the beginning of the war. This was it already from me for now. I hope this was interesting for you. If so, then please hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment for the algorithm. It really helps a lot. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to not miss future videos. You can also help the channel by recommending it to friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That was it from me for now. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting it. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.